Welcome to Breakpoint this week. From the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, I'm Maria Baer, alongside John Stonestreet, literally alongside John Stonestreet.
For the first time.
I'm looking at you.
For the first time in a long time. It's not our first time, but in a long time.
In a long time.
Yeah, up until now, we've just typically used deep fake videos of each other.
Yeah, it's not me. Yeah, it's a puppet. Okay, before we start today, I have to wish a happy birthday to my husband, Aaron. It's his birthday today.
You can't do that on the show.
Is your birthday coming up?
What? Oh, yeah, it is. I don't want to tell people when my birthday is.
My birthday's coming up too.
You do want to tell people.
It's on Monday. Did you want to say anything to me?
Happy birthday.
Oh, John, you remembered.
I did.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay, let's get into the show.
And that segment just typifies all that's different between this hosting team.
This is why we need to do this in person more often.
Is it? Is that why?
Listen, I'm so excited to talk to you about this first segment, though, because we want to talk about the oral arguments at the Supreme Court that happened earlier this week in the 303 Creative case. This is the case of the owner of a web design business here in Colorado. She creates custom wedding websites. And the state of Colorado does not want to allow her to say that as part of her business, she will not create custom wedding websites for same-sex weddings. So this was argued before the Supreme Court on Monday. I was on a long drive earlier this week and listened to the full oral arguments, which was actually kind of fun for reasons that will become clear in a moment. But the first thing I thought was, you know how when you're like 17 and you're studying for the SAT and you're like, this entire test is just analogies, and where does that come from and why is it useful? And now I know it's because in case you ever have to argue before the Supreme Court, you have to understand what an analogy is. I came across this story this morning in the Washington Post, which I'm still tickled by, because it's called Welcome to the Supreme Court's Hypothetical Christmas Mall Village. Because for those of you who, along with me, spent whatever it was, 3 hours listening to the oral arguments, it really quickly became just a series of hypothetical after hypothetical, where this is what happens a lot in arguing these cases. But the justices often come up with other hypothetical scenarios and bring them to the lawyers on both sides and ask what they would do in those cases. It's a way to try and suss out like the essence of the case. Because at issue in this case are several different questions. I do want to ask you about this in a minute, because it seemed like following some of their lines of questioning, I thought, okay, so the center of this case is what Lorie Smith at 303 Creative is doing, is that speech? Is that speech or not? Because some of the justices seem to suggest, well, you're just, recreating words that people tell you to say. So could you really call that speech? I don't find that to be a particularly strong argument, but that was one of the questions. Another question was, is what Lorie Smith is doing a public accommodation under law? So is she purporting to be open to everybody for business, and what implications does that have? Another question that I thought was incredibly important and a little confusing was whether Lorie Smith's objection to same-sex weddings constitutes a religious belief, and whether it constitutes a violation of status. So in other words, some of the justices seem to be conflating a person who wants to have a same-sex wedding with that person's identity as a person. So not separating out like the action of the wedding from the actual person for legal purposes. So it seemed to me that some of the confusion is around what's actually a part of this case. But in trying to determine that, they came up with all of these crazy hypotheticals. And some of them, weirdly, more than one of them revolved around a mall Santa. Like, what if there's a mall Santa who only wants to take photos?
Apparently, the justices were in the Christmas spirit they were coming in. They were celebrating Advent. It was front and center. So when they thought of all the analogies, it ended up being about Christmas
was always Santa.
And Santa Claus. Not necessarily about, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus, but hey, that's okay.
And then they got weirder. Like Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson had a hypothetical about an old grandma who has some sort of bakery, but she will only share her pastries because they're family recipes with devout Protestants. And so all the employees have to ask the people who come to eat.
This was a genius article in the Washington Post. You should read it.
It's so good. Okay, so the part I love the best is, so they start with that example from Justice Jackson. Do you smell that delicious smell? This is one of our most popular businesses, Grandma Helen's Protestant Provisions. Want to go inside? Don't worry, you don't have to be Protestant. Anyone can go inside. But yes, the special homemade treats that are baked using Grandma Helen's recipes are off limits to non-Protestants. And yes, employees will ask. Is that our strangest business? Oh, absolutely not. I wish it were. Look, here is Josh. He's a photographer, and Justice Alito felt that it was important that I share with you that he is Jewish. Do you need a photograph taken for JDate, a dating website geared toward Jewish people? Or for AshleyMadison.com, a website for finding extramarital affairs? Josh has to take both, even if he disapproves. He actually does a special package for both JDate and Ashley Madison, kind of an insurance if your JDate leads to marriage and then your marriage doesn't go superbly. That way, if you get caught, you'll get to answer a lot of fun questions like, why is the background in your affair website photo the same as the one that first caught my eye on JDate? They get better and better, and they go on to the Santa. Okay, don't worry. We also have a regular Santa who will take pictures with anyone. According to Justice Alito, he is Black. Regular Santa you would think would be a better experience than the Santa who will only take pictures with white children because he wants the pictures to accurately reflect the 1940s, which presumably didn't have Black children, I think was part of that hypothetical. But this Santa is constantly being beset by children in KKK costumes, something we don't like at all, but Justice Alito insisted on in his hypothetical. Justice Alito is responsible for some of our weirdest businesses. Wait,
there was a reference in the whole thing too to "It's a Wonderful." I mean, not in the article, but in the
It's a Wonderful
Life. Yeah. So, but little did they all know that they didn't need to come up with any hypotheticals. They just needed to wait 48 hours until our friend Victoria Cobb from the Virginia Family Foundation was disinvited from her reservation an hour and a half before her event at a restaurant in somewhere in Virginia. Yeah. And, so it is fascinating. I was asked this week on the World and Everything in It podcast on the weekly Culture Friday segment if, this will settle the issue. And, the short answer is the Supreme Court never settles an issue, particularly one of a culture war. But clearly not. And the reason is clearly folks want the from all beliefs want to have that sort of protection that the First Amendment provides: speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association. And some of the ones that are the most eager to have those protections are not the Christians, not wanting to participate in same-sex weddings or to communicate messages in support of behaviors that they don't like. It's folks who don't want to associate with people who believe those things about sex and about marriage and about gender and about, things like that. And those are the, more common examples that we're seeing over and over and over. And, the fact of the matter is, so that story again in Virginia, it was just was it the day after the oral arguments? Was it Tuesday? Was it Wednesday?
I saw Victoria, our friend, at the oral arguments. So I think it must have been the day after.
Yeah. I know it wasn't the same day, but it was just, you kind of look at it and you go, it's bringing an awful lot of attention to the Virginia Family Foundation, which is great because they do such great work. And I'm from Virginia, and shout out to her. But I think we kind of all agree, like, okay, that restaurant has. I mean, it's bad form, it's bad business. Yeah. She's going to get bad Yelp reviews.
But should the government force them?
This is not something for us to to take to the court. This is not something that we are. We want the government to enforce, right? And so, I was asked about that too, and I'm like, well, no, that's what the business wants to do, and that goes to the issue of public accommodation, right? I mean, between a business that designs websites for weddings and tries to get people to come and give gifts to the bride and groom and all that sort of stuff and tell their story versus a restaurant. The restaurant clearly fits into the level of public accommodation in a way that the others, and as you said earlier, public accommodation now is being interpreted, and that's a big part of this, to mean it's available or open to the wider public. Right. Obviously, that creates all kinds of issues to define public accommodation that way because churches are open to the public, right? I mean, that's on their sign. We welcome everybody. In historical terms, though, public accommodation was not about a business that's open to the public. It was about, in other words, it was not about access. It was about availability of services to folks that could be left out and therefore not allowed to participate in broader society. And this is coming right out of Jim Crow laws in the South, where an African-American family wants to take a trip across the southern U.S., and there's going to be towns where they won't be able to eat. They won't be able to get gas. They won't be able to have a place to stay at night. And so it was not a principle. The principle of public accommodation was not about equality and outcomes. It was about basically allowing or making sure that folks could participate in society. That, in the wake of the Masterpiece Cake Shop case and others, has been radically redefined. We don't even talk about what accommodation was originally intended for or what good it could possibly serve when it needs to be enforced from a legal perspective. We just talk about now this idea of access. And I just think that's a big problem because, in the case of the couple that asked Jack Phillips to bake a cake, there were 20 other bakeries within a short drive, maybe even walking distance, that would have given them the cake that they wanted. There was a whole bunch of other bakeries apparently in Denver, Colorado, and we know this because my friend Bill Jack went around and asked them to bake cakes with Leviticus verses on it that wouldn't do it. So he couldn't get his views publicly accommodated. But that's not what public accommodation has ever been about.
Right. So one of the things I wanted to ask you, because this stood out to me, was actually something that never got discussed in the oral arguments. And it seemed like in particular Justices Sotomayor and Kagan were conflating this. So they seem to be suggesting that, especially Justice Kagan kept talking about that she sees a difference between Lori Smith, for example, creating a wedding website that just announces a wedding, right? I'm announcing that Susie and Lily are getting married. And a wedding website that announces Susie and Lily are getting married and said, God blesses this union or something. She seemed to think, now the God blesses this union thing, sure, she shouldn't be forced to say that, et cetera, because that's like clearly a religious statement or whatever. But she kept asking, and so did Justice Sotomayor, how is announcing the wedding at all religious? Or at all violate her beliefs or whatever. And of course, I think to you and I, and to a lot of us, in the Christian worldview conversation, the easy answer there is you're using the word marriage to describe something that's not marriage, right? And that violates your belief both about what's true about the world, but also you could call that a religious belief in as much as you believe God created the world, right? But Kristen Wagoner, the lawyer for ADF, who I thought was this was just a masterclass in arguing before the Supreme Court. She was super poised. It was awesome to listen to her, but she never went there. And I wondered if part of the reason she didn't was because legally the definition of marriage has changed. So I don't know if that is even a tenable argument in a legal setting anymore, that even calling something a marriage that you don't believe is one should be a protected speech.
Well, she did say that there are people with sincere beliefs that believe same-sex marriage. I think the word she used is false.
Okay.
And so
yeah.
she did say that. And she also referred back, and this is the root of the whole conflict, right? In the Obergefell decision, Justice Kennedy, and the Obergefell decision was the decision that mandated same-sex marriage, overturned marriage laws in 30-some states, and basically gave same-sex marriage, to America as a nation. Justice Kennedy, who wrote that opinion and who spent his last several years on the bench, completely opposed to animus of all kinds. If there's animus, we don't like it. And so he wrote about animus all the time. And one of the things he wrote in Obergefell was trying to prevent animus against people who still held beliefs that millions of Americans held, whether they were religious or not. There's plenty of people, by the way, who don't believe that a union between a same-sex couple is marriage, right, for non-religious reasons. By the way, I wrote a book on this with Sean McDowell back in 2014 or something, and we look back at it and you realize that there are civilizations throughout history who had no Christian sexual morals underpinning how they thought about law and about family and about parenting or anything like that, where it was completely acceptable to have a homosexual relationship or homoerotic behavior, even including just really broken and awful things. never thought those unions could be called marriage.
Right.
Because, as Maggie Gallagher wisely put it years ago, there's three realities no matter where you go. Sex makes babies. Society has an interest in babies because they have an interest in their future. And babies do best with a mom and a dad. Mm-hmm. There's not a religious belief about that, right? That's just kind of obvious. So Justice Kennedy at least acknowledged that and basically called for no discrimination against people who believe that. And that they should be able to coexist. There shouldn't be some sort of, second-class citizenship, and there didn't need to be hostility. And all of us looked at it and said, yeah, that's a pipe dream. I mean, that's just, that's more make-believe than, the Christmas village that was invented on Monday. Yeah. I mean, of course. And you know what? That's been the source of all these really high-profile cases affecting things, from whether Christian colleges and Christian schools can control their own admittance policies, to how they handle student behavior, to whether businesses can be run according to people's deeply held beliefs, and whether or not the government can compel speech. Now, make no mistake, in the 303 case, and this is why this one's so important. All the things that Justice Kennedy hoped and predicted would not come to pass, the state of Colorado is bringing it to pass. The state of Colorado not only now has gone after two private business owners, and in the case of Jack Phillips, trying to force him not only to provide a service, but to go through re-education. And kudos, by the way, to Justice Gorsuch for bringing that up to the Colorado Solicitor General.
That made me squirm a little bit.
Oh, man, good for him.
He kept digging it.
The Colorado Solicitor General has kind of gone to the Supreme Court the last two times to get a public rebuke. It's been marvelous, but rightly so, because they have been extremely aggressive on this point. Again, not only attempting to force Jack Phillips to use his artistic talent to communicate a message in support of something that Justice Kennedy said it was okay not to believe in, but the state forcing re-education on him. In the case of Lori Smith, the way that case went in the 10th Circuit was that the state of Colorado admitted this was speech. I know that Sotomayor and Kagan were trying to do flip-flops to say, well, it is speech, but not really, and it's repeated speech, and you're just using words that are already there. I mean, I thought it just got really bizarre, and we can come back to some of the nuances there. But the way more, interesting thing here is that in the 10th Circuit courtroom, the state of Colorado said, we have a compelling interest to compel speech. That's chilling. Yeah. That is chilling. That's the state saying, because we have an interest to advance LGBTQ rights, we can force people to say things they don't believe in. Now, are there times in a cultural setting where the government could have compelling interest to compel speech because of something, really, really important? Potentially, yeah. I mean, you can think about wartime. You can think about different things.
Or like a mall Santa who really needs to.
I can't think of a time, by the way, when the state has.
Yeah.
But it's long been established that there are times where there are restrictions on freedoms by the state in order for compelling interest. Obviously, that was the case made across the board during COVID. We have a compelling interest here, and now we're realizing, okay, maybe that didn't all crack. It wasn't all it was cracked up to be. But this, I don't know if you've noticed, but every month is some month in support of some community that identifies as a sexual minority or a gender minority. I walk down the street in Colorado Springs, right now, and it has obviously a lot to do with what happened at Club Q and that horrific shooting. But there's a pride flag in every store window. There's not a compelling interest that is in place right now to promote this stuff, so I think this is going to be, and I think a lot of news outlets predicted this as well. And it's notoriously a bad idea to predict Supreme Court decisions, but I think we'll have a 6-3, or maybe depending on what Justice Roberts does, and I could be wrong, one of those kind of creative,
nuancing
5-3-1 decisions where Roberts just writes his own opinion because he doesn't like any of the other ones. But this is clearly about speech. In other cases, the Supreme Court's already decided that what happens online, website design, that counts as speech, and so some of this stuff is really already in place, and that the question is how broad will they actually get to the no Colorado? This is not a compelling interest, or something like that, or will it have implications? Will there be obvious implications for, Jack Phillips and for Barronelle Stutzman and for others who find themselves in that situation?
Yeah. Okay. So you're thinking that when you say 6-3, you're thinking that the case is probably going to be decided in Lori Smith's favor?
Oh yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that's pretty clear from the oral arguments and just kind of where the majority right now sits. And of course, that goes back to, like it or not, folks, elections have consequences, and this really matters. And also, look, the line of questioning from Kagan and Sotomayor in all these examples, what they did is they went to these hypotheticals that really tried to parse out what free speech is on the extreme boundaries of what speech is. Yeah. And that's something again, you mentioned earlier, I'm biased. I think Kristen Waggoner is just spectacular, and she did a spectacular job. And I read through it. I didn't watch, any of the videos, and it's an intimidating place to begin with. The number of times that she was interrupted was pretty unbelievable.
Oh man, that's the thing.
And I sensed a little bit of hostility from some of the justices, which, makes sense. That's the way this stuff goes. Mm-hmm. And, that's what she's, Kristen signed up for. But she made a very, very important point. And I think this is what's going to, I don't know about carry the day, but I think this is going to have to be considered. And that is, all these hypotheticals are dealing with a very real thing, which is speech has to be parsed out, and free speech has to be parsed out in its extreme cases, on the peripheral, on the edges, as she put it. What's taking place between the state of Colorado and Lori Smith, that's not on the edge.
Right.
That's not an extreme case. That's not something on the peripheral. That's not something that's, hard. Clearly what speech is, clearly deeply held beliefs, clearly what it means to protect the rights of citizens to have deeply held convictions and to live based on those convictions, not just to believe them quietly in our own minds. That's what this whole thing has always been about.
Let me ask you really quickly my last question about what you just said. It seemed like especially Justice Kagan was trying to differentiate between speech that is just speech, like asserting something, and speech that is markedly religious, which I, who am not a legal scholar or a lawyer, I took to mean that she was under the impression that speech has a special category of protection if it can be called religious. Is that some sort of legal test? Like, does Lori Smith and Kristen Waggoner, do they have the burden here of trying to prove that she wants to operate her wedding website business from a place of religious belief? Or couldn't she just simply say, like you said earlier, I don't think that's true about the world? Like, does she have to make the case that it's religious?
No, speech. Okay. Free speech is not directly built on freedom of religion. It's built on freedom of conscience. Okay. Right. And I mean, so, and I think Kristen Waggoner brought that up a number of times in the oral arguments. It's like, look, whether she's religious or not, this is a belief shared by millions. And, and of course, there's plenty of people who have come out in support of Lori Smith, who themselves identify as gay or lesbian or, some other, identity along the lines of the acronym. But no, it has to do with conscience rights, And now, of course, a lot of times that comes from religion.
Sure.
And that needs to be respected and honored as far as is possible within the government's ability to maintain a free society. And so that's why it has limits. And it does have limits, right? I mean, that's, it's the classic, you don't yell fire in a crowded theater. Particularly if you know there's not a fire, right? But speech is protected. And it's also very important, too, when you look at this case, that the First Amendment mentions speech, religion, and assembly together. Mm-hmm. Why? Because the speech is being born out of those deeply held convictions. And that also then has something to do with our public lives, which has to do with assembly. Mm-hmm. I can't force you to work with somebody else or to marry somebody else or, to meet with somebody else or to associate with somebody else or be associated with somebody else. Yeah. If to do that means that you're going to be complicit in something that you think is absolutely wrong.
Right, right. I think one of the saddest parts for me was it sounded like some of the justices just had no context, or it didn't, like no imagination for the possibility that announcing something called a same-sex wedding has anything to do with personal beliefs or conscience or religion at all. Like they talked about it as if it was the same thing as announcing like a sale at the sunglasses shop. Like these are the same thing. That's why they kept parsing out, like, do you have to say God blesses this union, or are you just announcing the wedding, and what's the problem there? And I thought this is an area of opportunity for Christians, and including the Colson Center, to continue helping our brothers and sisters understand that what you say about what the world is like is part of your conscience. Like it is, you're asserting something about the way the world was made. And I don't care how simple of a thing it seems like you're saying, that is all part of our conscience. And that's why we have to be so careful about what we say is true about the world.
It shouldn't surprise us that people from particular worldviews that do not begin with a framework in which there is a God who created the world in a particular sort of way would then think of marriage more as a social construct than as something built into the fabric of reality. Mm-hmm. But if you do believe that God created the world and that God described that creation pretty clear, or if you kind of look at the human body and the diversity and unity of the human body, male and female, and the procreative potential about it, and the good of children and the good of future, and you conclude that, hey, this is actually something, this actually means something, then there's no such thing, just like with the abortion debate, of the Supreme Court settling the issue because they issued a Obergefell. So to me, your observation is right. But it's less an observation about Supreme Court justices, and it's more an observation or a calling to Christian organizations and Christian ministries and pastors and others who also seem like too many in the political conservatives to think, well, I just wish this would go away. Yeah. I don't want to talk about this anymore. This is over. And there's so many right now organizations and people and ministers that are just willing to move on as if marriage actually did change, as if the Supreme Court actually decided it, as if it's no longer a matter of Christian conviction, as if it's no longer not only in the Scripture, but in the Scripture as a framing of how we can actually love our neighbors well, right? And how we can actually be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it as God commanded. This is not just kind of a side belief. This is not one of those kind of optional ones, within the drop-down menu of Christian theology. This is actually a fundamental belief about the world, how it works, and about the future of civilization and image bearers. But other than that, not important at all, right? And so it's just what your observation's right, but it actually says far more about those that wish this would go away so we could get on with, as people say, let's get on with, spreading the gospel. Now, look, the gospel is way bigger than marriage. It's not smaller. And, we believe that the gospel speaks to the nature of reality, particularly in a cultural setting when there's so many different definitions of reality that are vying for hearts and minds.
John, before we move on, just because we were just talking about speech and saying things that aren't true, you have a kind of a strange mug. So it says Bison Coolers on it, but then it has an outline of the state of North Carolina. And we were just discussing whether there are or ever were bison in North Carolina? I feel like your mug is telling a lie. Do you want to tell us about it?
Oh, well, I'm sure there is a bison somewhere in North Carolina. There's a star here on the state of North Carolina.
Bison
and I'm not
burgers.
sure if there's a bison right there in that particular place, which is
right
somewhere
there.
around Western North Carolina, which, of course, is one of the great places in all the country. I've never been to Western North Carolina to Franklin and what's the name of that place? Shoot. There's anyway, it's a great place.
Wow, this is
really is.
Raving review. Okay.
No, it is. It is a really cool mountainous place, super beautiful and all that. But I do not know. I do know, however, that of all the mugs that we have ever received,
oh my gosh, wow,
this is my favorite. So that is I'm sure I just offended a lot of people, but really it was intended to put out a challenge. So see if you can top
it.
The Bison Coolers mug.
I think this is the most
This is from our friends
at
Fellowship Adventures, which is a wonderful organization that does a lot of stuff for pastors and pastors, rest and
cool.
And that involves going somewhere and shooting things.
Bison,
not bison. I don't have no pheasants, but it's. Do you remember this? It's a really cool group that's run by a guy. You probably don't remember this, but there was a Christian band called Jeff Moore and the Distance. You don't remember that?
No.
I mean, they had a lot of hits. And
do you want to sing one for us?
Do not. And
okay,
I don't know that I can remember one, but I used to like them. I really do. I remember that. But anyway, Jeff Moore and the Distance is behind Fellowship Adventures.
Oh, so
and we
cool.
love it. Yeah, it's a great group.
That's
so
awesome.
The gauntlet has been tossed.
Wow.
Can you top?
Keep sending those mugs.
The Bison Cooler mugs.
It does look pretty nice.
It is.
It's
it keeps it warmer. There's nothing that I've ever had that keeps it coffee hot longer.
Also, if Bison mugs, if Bison Coolers is looking for a spokesperson and or if they want to send us
they want to sponsor the show,
yeah, we'll take it. Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to move on. I want to talk to you about some comments that former President Donald Trump made this week. And as we know, he has announced that he's planning to run for president again in 2024. So apparently there's a social media website that he is on. He went on here after he was kicked off Twitter. I believe he's been re-allowed back on Twitter under the Musk regime. But there's a social media company called Truth Social, which I was unaware of until this story came out. But apparently President Trump was on that platform earlier this week. And he tweeted something that understandably has created some ripples. So he was talking about the 2020 election. He still maintains that fraud happened and to the effect that he wrongly lost that election to President Joe Biden. And here's the tweet he sent out, or the message, he sent out on Truth Social, quote, "A massive fraud of this type and magnitude allows for the termination of all rules, regulations, and articles, even those found in the Constitution." So understandably, that's caused a lot of ripples. So let me just say, I think I've seen a handful of people this week who have been pretty strong supporters of President Trump come out in opposition to these comments and say, this is wrong, this is dangerous. It seems to me that what Trump is counting on in this instance, whether he's right or wrong, I guess we'll see. But he's under the impression that people who support him, at least the majority of his supporters, are supporting him as a person as opposed to as a politician within the confines of the system we have, the political system, right? And so he's under the impression now that he has enough support for him as a person and a personality that if we did have to suspend or change the system we're in, that support would be behind him. That I think is understandably extremely concerning.
That's a wrong calculation.
What was your take?
That's a wrong calculation. I mean, that's clear. And there's a number of different ways to look at this story. And of course, the most common one we've heard is a political analysis. Like, what does this mean for the future? What does this mean from the broad support that the president had enjoyed during his first run and his second run, and by conservatives? And there's clearly a bunch saying, no, we're not going there. That is not what we are going to do. We're not going to take something that violated the way we want to do our public life and then violate it in order to cover that. This is the classic two wrongs don't make a right sort of thing. And that's the argument that a lot of people are making. I'd point people to Dr. Moeller, Al Moeller, the president of Southern Seminary, had a briefing. That's his daily podcast commentary. And I think he did a spectacular job just kind of analyzing, okay, this is what this actually means for him to suggest this. And look, this was in response to President Trump's tweet. I don't know if he put it on Twitter or was it just on Truth Social. I think
it was just Truth Social.
But it was in response to revelations that, look, large social media companies, and these are companies that have complicated dramatically, what it means to protect free speech in the United States, because there's such a monopoly when it comes to communication from some of these platforms, Facebook, the big tech companies, and certainly Twitter, that they had actively collaborated with government officials in all kinds of ways, not just about the Hunter Biden laptop story, which is, what the president is responding to, but also we know now from COVID-related things to establish this is the talking points. This is what we're going to do, or we're not going to talk about this at all. Mm-hmm. Now, the revelations of that should absolutely concern everyone. Yeah. This is a big deal. That is a threat to the system, quote unquote. And I don't think the system is perfect. I don't think the system is necessarily divinely inspired, at least not in the sense of, God selected David to be king and God selected our system to be this way. That's not exactly what we mean. But it is, what did Churchill say, that it's the worst system except for all the others. It's the one that understands to some degree the human condition. It provides the sort of checks and balances. And when those checks and balances that govern the human condition aren't there, and that's what the revelation was from Twitter this week, through what Elon Musk kind of made known, I think that's a big, big, big threat. Yeah. But the response to say, okay, this is big enough to suspend the Constitution. I mean, look, that's either an extremely dangerous thing to say, or it's said by someone who does not have a grasp on reality because of the way they think of themselves. Mm-hmm. It's not okay. This was a biggie. This was a biggie. I know there was another related story about the president and Kanye West and anti-Semitism and so on. And certainly I don't think that the president's track record is anti-Semitic. This was a very bad look and a very bad decision to be publicly associated with that. But what we heard was a president who stood up in front of the nation just 6 years ago and swore an oath to protect the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, who then basically called for the suspending of the Constitution. Now, he did it on Twitter. So in the overall scheme of things, is him tweeting this really a threat to the Constitution? No. But it does tell you that there is that this points to something much bigger and much deeper. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to talk about that because there is a political analysis, but I think there's a worldview analysis that's far more helpful, because it is a way that we need to think about our political allegiances. It points to how we need to think about our lives publicly together as a nation. And we have really good information. The information comes from sociologists who have looked at civilizations and their rise and their fall and have pointed to really important things. I'm thinking here about the founder of the sociology department at Harvard University, Patiram Sorokin. And Sorokin's book, The Crisis of Our Age, if you ever can find that, it's worth picking up. It's not in print anymore, but you can find it probably in used books and that sort of thing. Harold O.J. Brown from Reformed Seminary did a kind of a summary of that book in a book called The Sensate Culture. That's also a really helpful read. But what Sorokin did is he did a look at a macro level at civilizations throughout history, both Western and non-Western, both those that we might call more civilized civilizations and also developing nations and so on. And what he found is that societies really can be these civilizations can really be put into kind of three categories. The first is what he called ideational cultures. Ideational cultures are those cultures that are built on ideals. So you think about the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. That wasn't a reality that they wrote. Mm-hmm. That was an aspiration. That put an ideal. That put something into the future that we could go after together. You can think about Islamic civilizations, and particularly those that believe in this idea of a global caliphate that is, part of the future. That's an ideal. It's not a reality. It's an ideal. Right. And cultures that live in an ideational sort of way are those that are building towards those ideals. And so therefore they tend to be those that are growing, right? Okay. Historically, the other big group, and he had a third grouping, which was kind of the muddle in the middle, and I don't think it's as important as these two groups, is this what he called the sensate culture, the civilizations that were sensate. If the ideational cultures were living out of ideals, the sensate cultures were living for immediate gratification. They did not have tomorrow in mind. They had today in mind. Now, it's interesting, and this is unrelated to this particular story of the president's terrible, proposal this past week, that Sorokin and also another British anthropologist named Joseph Unwin both pointed to the thing that makes society sensate or makes them unable to think about the future tended to be sexual brokenness. Because when sexuality is not governed and it's not ordered towards the future, procreation, and it's not protected within marriage, then it becomes a culture-wide pursuit of immediate gratification. Sure. I don't know if that sounds familiar, but it should, right? And so most often what makes a culture sensate is sexual brokenness and sexual anarchy. But sensate cultures were cultures that were spiraling downward. So cultures are on the move. They're either building or they're coming apart. And it has to do with whether there's an ideal that's bigger than a person, that's bigger than the moment, that sets your mind to the future. I think it's Proverbs, right, that says if there's no vision, the people cast off restraint. The vision keeps people in line, right? This is what many, many parents have found out, and many, many fundamentalist institutions have found out, that rules themselves don't make you obey. Rules themselves might make you better at breaking the rules. It's vision that makes you get in line, right? You live for something. You're headed in a direction, right? When I was growing up, I had a vision. I wanted to play basketball in college. That's what made me go out and play for 2 hours. That's what made me work on things, right? It wasn't the thought of today. It was the thought of tomorrow. Well, that's true for people. It's true of cultures. It makes sense, right? The ability to delay gratification is the whole game. Yeah. It's the whole game of whether you have a future as a person, as a family, as a society or not. And of course, that makes sense within a Christian worldview in which we're created for a purpose and there's things bigger than us, yet we still have value and that we can actually attain to something. Paul talks about that to Timothy. The whole book orients you towards things bigger than us and towards a future in which we run after, but we're helped by the Holy Spirit and by the plan of God. So it's the whole game, but it's the whole game for entire civilizations. And right now we have a political situation in the United States. And in this case, it was just exposed from President Trump that he didn't have a thought about the future, that all that mattered to him is whether he won or he lost. Right. And then willing to, call to a halt to the whole thing because of it. Look, that is an illustration of someone who is not thinking about anything bigger than himself, not thinking about anything bigger than the moment, not thinking about anything bigger than immediate gratification. And unless you're willing to say that he's the only one that can protect us from the bad guys. And, by the way, built into that is the thought that they're the bad guys, we're not, right, which is a violation of a Christian worldview and understanding of sin. I'm not saying that they're all equal, right? Yeah. The sexualization of children, I think that's either the next segment or next week's segment. It was last week's segment. It's my Monday commentary on Breakpoint. Good heavens. I've never added it all up. until the break point that's coming out, I believe, on Monday. But it's awful. I mean, this is the worst stuff we have seen, in centuries when it comes to the abuse and mistreatment of children. When you add it all up, it's stunning. So I'm not saying that that there's not really, really bad stuff out there, that there's not really, big threats to the American future, the American situation. Yes, there is. But unless you're willing to say he's the only one that can help us, unless you're willing to say that our future lies in a person and not in principles, right?
Yeah.
And this is the crisis that particularly political conservatives face right now. We have said this a number of times. For example, if you're ready to move on from marriage, if you're ready to move on, say, the Supreme Court settled that under Obergefell. Yeah. What are you conserving? If you're not conserving the family, conservatism is based on this idea that there are pre-political institutions that the political system has to protect. It has to conserve. That the best way for us to do our life together is to conserve the things worth conserving. And at the very fundamental foundation of that is the family. And when you violate the principles in order to say only that guy can save us now, that's where this becomes a real problem. Mm-hmm. Now, did the president have all that in mind when he put out that message? No, probably not. There's a reflection of character. There's going to be people that say, well, you should have known that. Well, look, we did. I think we did. I felt that certainly back in 2016. This was not a comfortable position. Yeah. The alternative was when you say, look, voting is a pragmatic sort of thing. Yeah. And look, the Supreme Court is the Supreme Court because of his administration. You have to acknowledge the fact that many of his policies were flat out great. And by the way, that tended to come because of the people he surrounded himself with. So I'm looking at this tweet or this post, what this is calling for, and saying, look, that is an unacceptable option. That is something that reveals something deep, and it is it reveals an entire way of seeing the world that Putirim Sorokin told us about, the difference between being ideational and being sensate, about living for immediate gratification or living for the future.
The hard part about it for me, what I think this sort of almost helpfully illustrates about the way we approach politics as an institution and what we should and shouldn't look for from it, is that I think there's a very compelling argument to be made that President Trump was always this sort of person. He never presented himself or seemed like a person who was going to champion an ideational culture, right? And I think from his his pre-political life through 2016 and beyond, through things he said and did, that was clear. I think probably rightly, in a pragmatic sense, like you said, a lot of Christians approached his candidacy politically as almost not in a dehumanizing way, but almost from the standpoint of like, we're puppeteers in the way that this is the way the American system is set up. We're supposed to elect representatives and then ask them to represent us and to do what we have asked them to do, or what by our vote we're asking them to do. And so a lot of people looked at President Trump, again, as you said, as the option on the table, looked at that pragmatic calculation and said, okay, we're going to go this way. And a lot of people understandably now are seeing, for example, as you mentioned, Al Mohler coming out and, strongly condemning these comments about the Constitution and finding hypocrisy in it, which I think is a hard case to make. But I do understand just a gut response. Like, this was a guy that you supported and now you're saying you don't support him. Part of that, I think, is the conflation between ideas and people. Like, just because Al Mohler, suggested that it was a pragmatic decision to support President Trump politically before did not mean that Al Mohler was saying President Trump is a wonderful person who can do no wrong and nothing he ever suggests I will disagree with. Unfortunately, because of the critical theory mood, I think that's the way we understand public comments these days, is they're synonymous with the person. But I think the way I'm making sense of this now, because I, like you, share like a deep concern about this. This is a violation of not just a social contract, but like the actual oath that he took before and is asking to take again. It's sort of like, it's sort of like coupling with someone who's committed adultery in the past and convincing yourself that he would never do that to you because he just said he wouldn't. Like, but he's made clear before that his fidelity has conditions in this case, and so he's not willing to do it. But I think where I can make sense of having supported his candidacy pragmatically in the past and not supporting this comment is putting politics in its right place, especially in our system now, which is what you mentioned before. We don't support people as people. We don't look to a single person and say the fate of the world or our civilization rests in your hands as a person. We look at it as a system of, protection or encouragement towards bigger ideals that are pre-political and that supersede political reality.
So there's a number of things there. One is, just to be clear, the Colson Center doesn't support a candidate or not support a candidate. We never did. We never will. That's a position that Chuck put us in, and we don't do it on the, slightly or on the side or whatever. What we try to do is speak clearly on the issues, which also try to call balls and strikes. And what that also means is, there were times in the run up to the 2016 election. There were times after President Trump took office that we were clear this is wrong. Something that he did, something that he said. There were other things that we didn't speak to, and part of that had to do with the outrage machine, which is everything we were supposed to be outraged about at all times, and condemn everything. And some of those things I just didn't think. We don't comment on everything that President Biden has done. We're not going to celebrate things. There was something obviously that happened this week with the release, the prisoner swap with Brittany Griner and the merchant of death swapping places in prisons. That has huge implications. There's plenty of people outraged. This is not something that, we know enough about behind the scenes and what was done and what was possible. And this is also something that, just because it feeds the already predetermined outrage machine, that's not what we're trying to do. So I just wanted to be super clear about that. Look, both in America, what you have is both the left and the right living out of ideals. So it's not that one side is ideational and the other side is sensate, although there's aspects of both, right, in their vision, and you have to determine which is which. But not all ideals that nations live to are the right ones, are the good ones. Mm-hmm. And so there's a trajectory and a direction that an ideal can take you that's awful. That's the case, for example, of Islamic fundamentalism and Islamic extremism, right? I mean, Osama bin Laden was living out of ideals. Right. And it directed a group of people, a civilization, although not defined by a nation state necessarily, but towards a particular direction that was just horrific. Yeah. There are certainly ideational aspects to a progressive vision for society. Where it's going to end up, it's going to be terrible. Okay.
But couldn't you argue that their highest ideal is being sensate?
Well, yeah, maybe. I mean, we can get into all that. But my point is that you have to deal with the options are on the table. Yeah. This is what I always thought was so profoundly helpful about the way Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrestled through both his theology and his ethics. We don't do ethics in an imaginary world. We don't do ethics in an ideal world. We do ethics in the real world, right? What he called the tempest of the living. Have the courage to come out into the tempest of the living. There are morally difficult decisions that we make, and we don't always make the right ones. Mm-hmm. So I don't think anything that I've said so far, and I'm sure we're going to get emails about it. I don't know if you knew that, but we get some emails sometimes. And I don't think anything about it is saying anything about that people who made just different decisions in 2016 or 2015 leading up or whatever are somehow morally evil for the decision they make. Yeah. No, not at all. You have to live in the world that you lived in. And this is we're really kind of clear. And by the way, the most, again, ideational progress that was made in the last 4 years under the President Trump and his administration was because he surrounded himself with people who had high ideals. Yeah. And that's the thing about voting for any candidate, but particularly higher offices, you're not voting for them. You're voting for a whole bunch of other people. In the case of the president, about 3,000, I think, if I remember the numbers correctly. And some of those have more impact than others. Just look at, the various mandates coming out now in the Department of Health and Human Services. So there's a pragmatism to this. And to say that there's not is to not live in the tempest of the living. What I'm saying has nothing to do with the history of that or who decided what back then. Not that anyone did it right, not that anyone didn't make mistakes. Of course, that's the reality of it. What I'm saying is specifically right now in that comment, it's a big deal. Yeah. And it's a big deal because of what it points to. And that's not a sustainable vision. It's not a sustainable vision for our life together. It's not a sustainable application of our theology in the political realm.
Yeah. John, we only have a few minutes left, but usually in this segment, we talk about different stories of the week and commentaries we've shared, which you can find over at breakpoint.org or you can listen to in the Breakpoint podcast thread. But there was such a great one this week. I feel like I say that every week. But you and Dr. Glenn Sunshine did this one together about how John the Baptist bridges the Old and New Testaments. This is something we're working on this Advent, is kind of looking back through the beginning of the Christmas story and what implications that has for us. What I loved about this commentary is because this is something I came to later in my Christian life, is the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament, that the Christmas story was not, I think one time you said you had a friend who uses this phrase, we tend to drop it out of the story. Is that the phrase? Where we think of the Christmas story as like its own standalone thing. It's just this really cool, beautiful thing that we celebrate. We give each other gifts. It's like part of the Christian religion. The coming of the Messiah was what the Jewish people have been waiting for since like literally Genesis 3, when God was like, I'm going to put enmity between your offspring, talking to the enemy, and the offspring of people. And this wasn't just one little part or like a rare interference of God into the world that he created. This was like the pivotal turning point of history. And John the Baptist was, as you and Glenn pointed out, he was the promised messenger, the very last word spoken to Malachi the prophet, who was the last prophet in the Old Testament period, talking consecutively here, was that God would send a messenger to prepare the way for the Messiah. And the very first words of the New Testament, the opening of it, is the telling of this messenger that he's here and he's coming. And it's just incredibly powerful.
Yeah, well, yeah, it is. And it is important to realize that there's a story of reality at work. And that's really what Christianity is. It's the announcing of the king of the universe, the king of the story, and it clarifies again what that real story is, and that's why Jesus himself, when he's revealed, now later, of course, in the New Testament by Paul, by John, and by the author of Hebrews, we are told very clearly that, hey, Jesus was there at the beginning, and Jesus has been there throughout, and through that lens, we start to see these, amazing stories in the Old Testament where, scholars point and say that's a pre-incarnation appearance of the Word. And of course, John says this, the Word was from the beginning, all things were made through him, and so on. But when Jesus appears, he appears within the story. Mm-hmm. Now, he's writing the story. He's there at the beginning as well. Mm-hmm. But when he's manifest there in part of a larger story. And so Zechariah is just an amazing thing. I mean, literally, what we hear from Malachi is that this is, he's going to come, he's going to turn the hearts of the fathers back to the children. And that's exactly, what Zechariah, when he's able to speak in the fulfillment of the word of the angel that tells him he's going to have a son, and that the sign is because he was doubting he's not going to be able to talk. Just an amazing sort of thing. But, Zechariah's prophecy, Elizabeth's song, Mary's song, and the Magnificat, and then Anna and Simeon, when Jesus is taken to the temple for circumcision. what they all point to are these promises. What they all point to is this narrative that starts in the Old Testament and goes all the way through. And that's why Advent, I think, is such a helpful thing, because, if you actually go through the Advent readings from the Book of Common Prayer, for example, or there's, wonderful other resources there as well. The Center for, I can't remember what they're called, but they're at Biola University. They have a cool Advent series too that's digital. And there's just all these resources, and that's what they do. They remind you of things. In the Book of Common Prayer, like the first 2 weeks of Advent readings are not, He's coming, He's coming, He's coming. It's judgment's coming, judgment's coming, judgment's coming, right? So it puts it all in the context of like, no, this is part of this is the critical moment that you're preparing for in the whole story of the world and all of reality. This is the critical moment. Yeah. This is the thing that's going to define everything else. Lewis put it this way. He said, the greatest miracle asserted by Christians is the incarnation, because if it's happened, it's not only the greatest event in the history of the earth, it's the thing that the whole story has always been about. And he says that in Miracles, I think. So, it's a wonderful thing to reflect on. It's one of those things you can continually go back and reflect on again and again and again, year after year after year. It's a wonderful way, by the way, of talking to your children and grandchildren about what Christmas is, because what you're doing at the same time is promoting a narrative, countering the other narratives. Yeah. You know what I mean? And of course, that's the story of Western culture right now, is the collision of narratives, not just about Jesus or about God or about morality, but about all of life in the world, about who we are, about whether history has a purpose or not, whether there's meaning to the universe or not. Yeah. And that's a way to do this, through the lens. In other words, I guess the point is, do Christmas worldviewishly. How's that? Yeah.
It's one of those things where we spend most of the year talking about parts of our worldview that, understandably, we talk about them the most because they are what's on the surface most contested. Like, do you really believe there are 2 different genders? Do you really believe marriage is this and that? And this is one of those stark reminders where, like, if you want to use the word strange, the strangest or the most consequential thing we believe is that God actually was born as a human being, like walked on the same earth we're on. We actually think this actually happened.
Yeah, if that happened, a lot of the other crazy stuff just kind of makes sense.
But it's also been, and this commentary especially, but others as well, has been a helpful reminder for me in particular this year that Mary and Simeon and Anna and Elizabeth and Zechariah, they were expecting a Messiah already because of those promises before. We're in a similar position because we know the promises that Jesus is going to come back again. And it's a reminder to me to approach like our current Advent, if you want to call it that, with the same sort of expectation, where if an angel comes to you and says Jesus is coming back or Jesus has returned, you're not saying like, I don't know what that word Jesus, like who are you referring to? Like we don't have any context for it. We need to know the scriptures in the way that Mary and Anna and Simeon did, like to have that heart of expectation, not only so that like it will help us in our patience as we wait, but also increase our joy when he does come back, like Mary's joy when she was told what was happening, because she knew she was expecting a Messiah. This wasn't out of left field. I mean, I'm sure there was a shock, obviously, that she happened to be the one that God was entrusting to carry him, but she knew that the world was waiting for a Messiah and that he was coming. And that should be how we approach the second coming of Jesus as well. Okay, let's call it there. Let's talk about recommendations for the week. Outside of, I have to recommend that piece in the Washington Post. It's a little snarky, but it's just so funny. So that one is called Welcome to the Supreme Court's Hypothetical Christmas Mall Village. The biggest problem I have with all those hypotheticals is Justice Jackson's hypothetical of the photography business in the mall that's trying to take pictures with kids with Santa, but she wants them to be in the category of It's a Wonderful Life. And so he won't take any photos with any children who are not white, which to me, like, that's such a bad analogy, John, because that's just a casting call. You're just like doing an art project. That's not a public accommodation, right?
Yeah, I think there was some African Americans in It's a Wonderful Life, if I remember, weren't there?
Well, they definitely existed at that time in history.
Well, yeah, no, but I think it's actually there. There's a cast member.
Okay, fair enough.
Anyway,
what's your recommendation? Well, let me give I'll give my Christmas music recommendation for. I'm trying to do this all Advent. My Christmas album this week is going to be Sarah Groves' album, Joy of Every Longing Heart, which I've said this before about Sarah Groves, but she's the queen of vibes. Like if you just want to sit down and have a relaxing evening, you've got to put on Sarah Groves. But this is a beautiful Christmassy, Adventy album called Joy of Every Longing Heart. So that's my music recommendation.
Mine's going to be more snarky. Like I think in the spirit of Mary Did Know and the cause that we need to all take up, which is to tear down terrible Christmas music. I just was reminded on Facebook of my memory in which from 2 years ago, in which I said, John Lennon and Yoko Ono, let's write the worst Christmas song ever. And then Train says, hold my beer or hold my eggnog, I think is what I said, which is pretty. And I heard this, song from Train a couple of years ago. And I was like, what on earth is this foolish
It sounds
nonsense?
like a bot wrote it, like
I don't
an
know
AI.
what it is, but anyway, I think we should have a kind of a casting call or a call out for what are the worst Christmas songs ever. And let's just call them out. You know what I mean? Because it really was like in the running has got to be Paul McCartney and John Lennon and Yoko
So This
Ono.
Is Christmas one? Mm-hmm. But what about the one that says there won't be snow
Christmas
in Africa?
See, that's in the running too.
Because it snows in Africa, man. Well, and they also do know it's Christmas time in Africa.
Christmas kind of started there, so they're pretty clear that's the whole thing, like the center of Christianity was there. So anyway, what are the worst Christmas songs that people have? Those are we might have just stolen all of them because those are four in the running for just yes, they do know it's Christmas. Yes, Mary knew. I'm not saying Mary Did You Know is in that list. It's not a bad song. It's okay. I just want to be sure that we know that Magnificat actually exists. But the bigger part is the apparently the feud between the Beatles took the form of who could write a dumber Christmas song.
The worst song. I am going to call you.
Train just won. Train just killed it. So
Christmas Shoes. I'm going to call you on your birthday and sing Mary Did You Know.
Okay.
I just want to prepare you emotionally for that. The other thing I will recommend this week is, I think I recommended this last year, but there's a kid's book called The Littlest Watchman. And
how are you doing another?
I know, because I just thought of it and I love it so much.
You're stepping over mine.
And we just talked about the John the Baptist thing. Oh, did you have another one too?
No, I only have one. That's the job. That's what we're supposed to have
thing.
Is one. You should save that one for next week.
All right, I'll save it for next week. Suspense. That's our cliffhanger. Thank you so much for listening to Breakpoint this week. As a reminder, you can find links to the stories we talked about today, as well as other commentaries and resources at breakpoint.org. Just a quick plug, if you are thinking about your giving for the end of the year, which I know a lot of us are thinking about this time of year, would you consider giving? You can do that at colsoncenter.org to the work we do here. Please send in your worst Christmas song recommendations and or your mugs from Bison Coolers or wherever, so that John can continue to get really passionate about his coffee mugs. And we'll see you all next week.